Thank you all for coming and coming to the second session of this already incredibly exciting conference. This panel is about pathogens, as you know. And as I mentioned previously, pathogens are perhaps described today as the most serious kind of invasive. You know, they cross borders and boundaries at these, unbelievably quick speeds, threatening pandemics. We're constantly, seeing these alerts around. We had Ebola when we wrote this and thought about the panel. With Zika didn't exist in our imagination. We didn't know, and now, of course, it's the prime thing that is being talked about. One of the many things carry over from the previous panel, but one of them was that we thought in particular that connected these was the strategies of quarantine. We think of detention centers, we think of camps, but we also think of the closure of borders to viruses as much as people. So we're going to be continuing that kind of a conversation. And we're also going to be talking about how certain kinds of privileged people affect the diseases that poorer people get. So, and I think one of our panelists, Nathaniel, is going to be speaking about trash as well. So we're going to have the circulation of viruses and of people and of things all together here. I'm very happy to introduce our panelists, who are all just happen to be MDs and many other things, anthropologists and public health specialists. Our first speaker is going to be David Napier, who's a professor of medical anthropology at the University College London and director of its Science, Medicine, and Society Network. He's been a fellow at a number of universities and colleges, including Harvard, and NYU, and Johns Hopkins, All Souls, Oxford, so on. His special interests include perceptions of the foreign, of xenophobia, immunology, and caring for ethnically diverse populations, migration and vulnerability, and homelessness. And he publishes really widely in all kinds of different places, on law and anthropology, even on art and anthropology, and intellectual property and biodiversity. And he's the author of many different kind of books, chapters, and articles. David has been involved in multiple levels, both kind of academically, but on a more practical level. He's been involved in 3 Lancet commissions. And the most recent one is the 2014 one on culture and health. His most recent book is Making Things Better, which is Oxford University Press in 2013, and explores notions of property and local value across cultures. You can find his work in the New York Times, and the Financial Times, and the Guardian, and many other places. He's currently the academic lead on a Global Cities Changing Diabetes initiative and editing a book on new and emerging pathologies. Our second speaker is going to be Nathaniel Hupert, who is a professor of healthcare policy and research at Weill Cornell College at Cornell University. He's also an associate attending physician of internal medicine at New York Presbyterian Hospital, or is that's all current, yeah?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And he's a senior medical advisor of Health and Economics Modeling Unit in the Division of Preparedness and Emerging Infections. So we have somebody who's dealing immediately with these kinds of crises as they develop and thinking about how to respond. He's also a member of the National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and he's a medical advisor for the National Healthcare Preparedness Program, again, the OEM, Office of Emergency Management. And finally, he's part of the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So if you detect anything, you go here to him. Okay, and our last speaker is Vinh Kim Nguyen, who is an emergency physician and medical anthropologist. He's both practitioner and researcher and concerned with the relationship between science, politics, and practice in global health. He practices emergency medicine at Avicenne, the hospital, I guess if you translate it, it's Avicenna Hospital in Paris, and the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal, and he currently holds one of these big ERC consolidated research grants on the science and politics of a world without AIDS. And he heads a team of anthropologists researching the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. He's a professor of global health at the University of Montreal and holds a chair in anthropology and global health at the University of Amsterdam and the Collège d'Études Mondiales in Paris. He is the author of The Republic of Therapy, Triage and Sovereignty in West Africa's Time of AIDS, and the co-author with Margaret Locke of An Anthropology of Biomedicine, and also a co-editor with Jennifer Klott of The Fourth Wave, Violence, Gender, Culture, and HIV in the 21st Century. And of course, they all have written many articles in all kinds of different journals. So we are going to just go right ahead, and we're going to go through all the speakers. And then what I'd like to do is actually create maybe a conversation immediately amongst the panelists, so we can ask each other questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So the first speaker is David, called Epidemics and Xenophobia. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you very much, Miriam. I have to begin with a disclaimer because I'm the guy who had intended to become a medical doctor, but who did volunteer work in Guatemala and Honduras during the revolution and decided I wanted to do something else. So, my talk is about, as the title suggests, epidemics and xenophobia. What I'm not going to talk about is what I've spent the last 2.5, 3 decades studying, which is immunology, both theoretical and applied. But I would like to just say before I begin that I think there is a brighter side of my presentation, and that has to do with changes that are occurring in the science of immunology and regenerative medicine that actually attends not so much to xenophobia, but actually to xenophilia. That is to say, what are the things that attract us to one another, and even at times at great risk, create domains of attraction. And I can speak about that in the discussion if you like. But what I've been charged to talk about is something somewhat darker, which is the epidemics and xenophobia. And I was very amused by Arian's introduction about the university in exile, because, of course, the first slide that I want to show is this one, which is, as it were, to state the obvious. That is to say, to connect epidemics, I said academics, and xenophobia, is to state something of the obvious, a moral problem that has existed throughout the history of humankind. But what's more interesting, perhaps, is to ask the question of why similar forms of racism reemerge, even in otherwise highly multicultural and even cosmopolitan settings. And I think in the aftermath of this state's primary, it's useful to, by comparison, see some of the language that's emerging as common political discourse in America today. And in my view, to take extreme caution to the extent to which this kind of language replicates things that we otherwise would find completely reprehensible and intolerable. So I'm troubled by the fact that this is re-emerging, and also the fact that it's re-emerging in other places which are otherwise considered quite liberal and accommodating, in the past at least, of dissidents. This is the Swiss People's Party about creating safety, and what we see are 3 white sheep giving the black sheep a good boot back across the border. You can find these posters all over Switzerland in train stations and public places, bus stops. So the question of why this is actually even remotely tolerated today is something that I find incredibly astonishing, not to mention the more subtle ways in which we treat those who migrate under conditions of extreme duress. And Miriam, thank you very much for distinguishing the whole topic of mobility and making the positive discrimination between those who migrate under duress and the fact that mobility, as it were, is something that we commonly accept and indeed in times encourage, provided that people have the appropriate financial means to make what's considered to be appropriate contributions to the places to which they migrate. I also want to express my concern for the fact that it's not only the notion that these concepts emerge in post-multicultural environments, but also the fact that they occur so variably across societies that otherwise see themselves as similar. Here we see poor Casey Hickox, who you all remember was met by a fleet of police escort and told by her fellow citizens of the state of Maine that she was not actually wanted, that she should not return, even though she had tested twice negative for Ebola. And I want to compare, there are many other examples of this, but the gentleman on the right is Mike Jacobs. He's somebody I write with. He runs the Ebola clinic at the Royal Free Hospital in Hampstead, where Mike has repeatedly said in the press that the actual treatment of Ebola patients within London poses no public threat. So we're dealing on the one hand with a response in the United States to this problem as one in which somebody who's actually tested negative is so victimized, and on the other, an environment which otherwise we would see as comparable, where this is not the case at all. This is not to elevate what's happening in London, when we've seen plenty of examples already where there's nothing to be proud of in that regard to migration, but to merely point out that these that these variations are themselves indicative of what I've tried to call in the past a moral epidemiology, and I know this term has been used otherwise by other people and for various ends. I show you this picture not to promote my own work. This book's actually out of print, so you couldn't buy it if you wanted to. But to point out the fact that if you feel bad about not understanding why these things are happening, I've spent about 25 years trying to work on this one problem and don't feel like I've made a tremendous amount of progress. So I would highly recommend your attending to some of the wonderful works that have been mentioned by the speakers already and the ones that we are about to hear tomorrow as well, because within their work is some of the most thoughtful thinking on this subject that I know. And I'd also like to throw in at least one other name. There are probably 20 or 30 that I could, but one of the ones that's really had an impression upon me is that of Didier Fasson in Humanitarian Reason, which is a very deep and thoughtful volume, but in which he succinctly describes this moral variability. Talking about his own nation, France, he says, as with other nations, France is more generous the less it has to bear the cost of its generosity. In other words, it's a whole lot easier to accommodate when you don't feel threatened, and feeling threatened will limit your ability to accommodate, which is, I think, something to think about when we go back to this really horrifying quote by Donald Trump. So just to say that we equate epidemics with racism and xenophobia, and that we accuse sometimes the most vulnerable people as bearers of disease, the accusation argument, as it were, is, in my view, doesn't add a lot to our knowledge of why, when, and how we marry an epidemic outbreak with the fear of the foreign. Better, I think, to ask what can be added to the conversation that might advance tolerance and understanding of those we perceive as unlike us, whoever and however we define, as it were, us, which, of course, is always something that we negotiate on a daily basis. So the question that I'm intrigued by is, what are the social drivers of tolerance and intolerance? And this has more to do, I think, with perceptions of betrayal, ideas about social trust, and how these are negotiated on a daily basis, and what the effects of their disruption are on people's willingness actually to engage with things different than themselves, however they define that. So here I think it's worthwhile to reconsider what has happened to the study of tolerance and shared values, that is, to societies and cultures as empathic constructs, that is to say, as constructs about people relating to one another. Because while social science has moved away from the study of culture towards a more nuanced understanding of lived experiences of individuals, seeing actually the study of culture as oftentimes a worrisome problem, the idea of culture and cultural difference has, if anything, emerged very powerfully in social discourse as a social fact. And of course, we saw this was alluded to earlier, Donald Trump's tiff with the Black Lives Matter movement. But it's not just the way in which culture has emerged as a ploy for attacking tolerance and multiculturalism, but also in daily discourse, in which we increasingly use the term to describe not only overtly shared ideas, but also taken for granted assumptions of people living and working together. And of course, there are lots of examples of this where we think of culture in a, as it were, stereotypical traditional sense. But also we have corporate cultures and hospital cultures, and indeed we have academic cultures based on things like prestige hierarchy and the publications that we manage to build our careers around. Now, I think it's interesting to think about this because rather than simply standing up against and being critical of overt racism and leaving it at that sort of global human rights narrative, which I think is quite important, I believe it's useful to inquire about the ebbs and flows of moral discourse, about how morality unfortunately becomes negotiable and relative, and to re-examine what anthropologists have noted about the way the concept of culture as dynamic systems of shared values and conventions about, as it were, us and them, are both used constructively in an empathic way and also misused in a destructive way, as I've alluded to. And indeed, it was this idea of culture that we had in mind when we persuaded The Lancet just over a year ago, on November 2014, to put this on the cover of the first time in 23 years that they had actually thought about the issue of culture and health, in which they claimed that the systematic neglect of culture and healthcare is the single biggest barrier to the advancement of the highest standard of health worldwide. And of course, what we were trying to do here was not to have them think about culture in stereotypical ways based upon patterned behaviors of competency drawn along cultural lines, and to suggest that people relate to one another in those, with those stereotypes in mind, but to rekindle an assessment of the dynamics of shared conventions, whether we are talking about West Africa or the WHO and the CDC's behavior. And of course, I'm much encouraged to be able to inform you that the WHO is actually right now engaging in a self-critique of its, as it were, own cultural practices. So what I'm saying is there's something to be gained by this that actually I think we as social scientists should be a bit more aware of. In our committee, we had almost 52 people. Well, I say almost because we had 27 authors and 27 advisors who sat down intermittently to try to come up with definitions of how we would define culture. We actually ended up with this really simple, if I can get this slide to advance, there we go, simple definition provided by Robert Redfield, way back in 1941 in his work in Mexico, where he uses culture, defines culture simply as conventional understandings manifest in act and artifact. Now, we like this not only because it was economical, but also because it was ecumenical. That is to say that, thinking about culture as conventional understandings, as shared conventions, allowed us to point out the fact that conventional understandings are, on the one hand, oftentimes overt, and other times they're quite covert. That is to say, they can be quite taken for granted. This is something that we sometimes call the anthropological paradox. Culture is something that all of us have. On the one hand, we say it takes one to know one, so that if you want to know someone's views of what they value, you ask somebody of that category of society, however you define it. But also we acknowledge that the hardest thing to know is your own culture. That is to say that to be critical about what it is that you assume to be the case, however you define that, is one of the most difficult things that we all face. Acknowledging the limitations of your own take-it-for-granted assumptions is about the hardest thing, I think, that any one of us can do, precisely because those assumptions are, as it were, taken for granted. But there are exceptions to this, and I think it's worth examining some of these exceptions. I don't have time to examine many, but I do want to bring up two of them very quickly. One, it goes way back to 1969 and the late Frederick Barth. Frederick was a great friend of many of ours who passed away last month, but he had the wonderful idea of pointing out the fact that culture is not only a function of shared ideas, but it's also a rather Zen idea. That is to say, like an empty vessel. It's something that is, as it were, empty in its taken for granted context, but something that is rather defined at its peripheries, however you define them, where it's contested and challenged. And this is a rather functional and structural idea that perhaps is somewhat unfashionable today, but it does actually bring to our attention the fact that what we do need to be alert to the fact that we all have cultures, we all have empty vessels and taken for granted assumptions. And this point, that we are oftentimes unaware of this, helps to impel the need to become curious, I think, about challenging ourselves with the unknown by experiencing difference and by learning how to accommodate it. And this is something that philosophers have also taken up, most famously Bertrand Russell in his description of the problem of inductive knowledge. So I want to consider this very briefly for a moment because there's a wonderful book that's been written about this that many of you may have read by your fellow New Yorker Nassim Taleb called The Black Swan. So I'm going to quote from this very briefly. Against what Taleb calls in The Black Swan the unconditional benefits of past experience, that is to say what we pretty much assume we can take for granted because of what's happened in our lives, Russell's example demands a question. This is the question of the chicken going to slaughter. How can we know the future given knowledge of the past? Or more generally, how can we figure out properties of the infinite unknown based upon the finite known? In other words, what we repeatedly take for granted, or Barth's empty vessel. Consider a turkey that is fed every day, he says. Every single feeding will firm up the bird's belief that it is the general rule of life to be fed every day by friendly members of the human race looking out for its best interest, as our politicians might tell us. On the afternoon of the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, something unexpected will happen to the turkey. It will recur a revision of belief. Russell's question is this: what can a turkey learn about what is in store for it tomorrow from the events of yesterday? A lot, perhaps, but certainly a little less than it thinks. So the problem with staying in the, as it were, chicken coop, or to use another metaphor, the isolated village, or the ring-fenced post 9/11 United States, however you want to define this, the problem with staying on the inside is that this actual position is actually quite dangerous because you have no idea of what's happening in the outside. This is the old anthropological juxtaposition between the village and the bush. So there's a serious problem with retrenchment, namely that introversion produces a certain kind of ignorance. Indeed, one of the things we forget about migration more generally is the migrants, whether they are refugees or people who are economic migrants, however you define it, migrants always are more interested in learning about the places they migrate to than are citizens of receiving countries about the details and practices of the places that migrants come from. Unless maybe you happen to be an anthropologist or an aid worker or somebody who's devoted their career to actually trying to understand this. Now, this is not new to us, and of course, it's the subject of political discussion. And for all of the lampooning of his statements, of course, it's what this guy, Donald Rumsfeld, had in mind with his unknown unknowns. That is to say, how do you actually account for the levels of your own ignorance, and how do you know what you do not know? As a homeless friend of mine said to me a long time ago in describing my inability to understand what it was like sleeping on the street. Okay. So knowing about difference is important for human survival and growth, which is why the military idea of the avant-garde, the advanced guard, actually migrated from World War I trenches, which is, of course, where it began. The advanced guard were the people who actually got out of the chicken coop and went out and saw what was happening on the borders. You go too far away, and you don't come back to actually inform anyone. You don't go far enough, and you don't learn anything. 5 minutes, okay. So the whole idea of actually going out and exploring borders is a really important one. And this was noted by, of course, the people who Hitler, to get back to the beginning of the talk, hated most. That is to say, the artists and intellectuals, who obviously the Dadaists and Surrealists, who used this concept to talk about going to the limits of what somebody could understand and actually exploring the limits of the human imagination. And here we see on the right Salvatore Dali's very famous image. Is this a head on its side, or is it people sitting around in a village in front of a dwelling? And of course, for the Surrealists and Dadaists, the trick was not to see it as one or the other, but to try to see it as both. That is to say, to explore that periphery of the human imagination. So, to get back to where I began, where the likes of Hitler and now Trump feel threatened by, rather than curious about almost anything new and different, whether it's helpful or harmful, there is something to be said for the need to explore boundaries. And I know I'm running out of time here, but I want to just go through one or two more slides very quickly, if I might. One of them is an image that I have found very stunning. I've used it more than once in various publications. But this is a picture of an aging cell colony on a petri dish. And what's really interesting about this is that it's rather like a ring-fenced environment. But this cell colony doesn't die from the periphery, it dies from the center. And the reason it dies from the center is because all those cells actually, when entropy takes place and things starts to slow down, they huddle together to conserve heat. And that black part in the middle are actually the spores that they create to protect themselves. So what we're actually looking at in the late cell colony is the consequences, as it were, if I can push that argument a bit further, of ring fencing. In times of high uncertainty, we revert to this. And retrenchment is not only often a sign of moral weakness, then it's also a sign of dangerous ignorance. Now, I was going to say, had I had more time, and perhaps I can in the discussion, that this is also something that's been noted for a very long time. Nietzsche told us a long time ago that that the idea of accepting bad meaning over no meaning is an extremely dangerous posture. He says in Beyond Good and Evil that any meaning is better than no meaning. And of course, retrenchment is something that Durkheim wrote about in his notion of anomie, that is to say, the way in which the psychological and physical weariness and disillusionment pushes people into a tendency to grope at random, which in turn brings on other crises until life itself seems intolerable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end here with of course, a quote from someone, of course, I think is probably America's greatest philosopher, and that's Mark Twain, who said quite, I think, succinctly that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. And I will add to that a lovely passage from Stuart Hampshire's Freedom of the Individual, where Hampshire asks the question, how can you say what someone is trying to do unless you know what that person expects to happen? In other words, unless you have a genuine curiosity about difference, how can you at all anticipate why somebody might be engaged in what it is that they're doing? So for me, the problem of epidemics and xenophobia is a real one. We had a meeting at this lovely place last year, Bellagio, to convene a task force on epidemics and xenophobia. We wrote a petition, which you can find on change.org. I would invite you wholeheartedly to read that, to sign it if you feel you agree with it, and to circulate it. And meanwhile, thank you very much.
Our next speaker, thank you very much, David. Our next speaker, Nathaniel Hupert, and his talk is entitled, Who's Invading Whom? Zika and Plastification of the Planet.
Sure, thanks. I actually changed the title a little bit because even my closest associates looked at me and said, what's plastification? And the answer is it's covering things in plastic. So I changed the title to this, and I think this perhaps gets at the spirit of the types of things that Arian the Center for Public Scholarship have tried to bring to the fore in fora like this. I do have to just comment before I start that I am contractually working with two entities within the federal government, the CDC and the Office of the Assistant Secretary. So I legally have to say this, which is that nothing that I say represents the views, opinions, or recommendations of the federal government. And so now that I've said that, I can begin, and I'll try to keep to our time limit strictly. If you go on the internet, you can find any number of mostly really offensive images of the juxtaposition of disease and the other. This I chose because it has to do with mosquitoes, and it doesn't have any really offensive imagery, which I would feel very uncomfortable showing. But certainly during World War II, especially in relation to venereal disease, posters like this with this type of message were obviously extremely common. And we can laugh about this, these really puerile war comparisons, but they show up to this day. So we talk continually in medicine about having wars on this and wars on that, the war on diabetes, the war on heart disease. Here it's the war on disease in general, and we're winning because the curve is going down, which is great. I was mentioning to Arian a moment ago that, you know, if you go through medical school, anyone here in medical school? Okay, good on you. Great, keep going. If you attend an American medical school in this day and age, you will essentially get no theory, zero. If you attend a school of public health, you might get some. When I was getting my master's of public health degree, I took a course called The Ethics of Public Health. And the instructor on the first day said, there's no such thing as ethics of public health, so we're going to do medical ethics. And he proceeded to have a semester-long course about the classic medical ethics cases that you all know about. It was very disappointing. And luckily, there was another teacher I found at that school who did engage in what are, we can all imagine, the momentous ethical dilemmas that are involved in public health, one of which I'll mention at the end of this talk. So war, obviously, is a nice dyadic type of setup. And in health generally, and in public health, we can come up with a number of these, some of which are really in vogue now. So there's obviously especially with regard to things like obesity, the unitary perspective where essentially it's all your fault. What you eat, how you act, whether or not you exercise. There's a historical precedent for the germ theory of disease setting up this notion that we are combating other things. Interesting, and I'd love to hear more from a French perspective, perhaps later in this panel. There's the French notion of the terrain on which the battle takes place, which changes that dynamic because the terrain is not really you and not really it, it's something else. So there's potentially this triad of sanitation or microbiomal world that we now are hearing a lot more about. In the work that I do with the federal government, especially looking at disease pandemics, there's now a very overwhelming and I would say a little excessive appreciation of and interest in networks, because physicists, who turn out to be some of the best infectious disease modelers, really like creating contact networks and rapidly exploring the mathematics of how diseases play out among contact networks, either just of humans or humans and vectors. And these networks can become extremely complex. And often what we find is that these networks give us insight into how diseases actually do propagate in the real world. But seemingly just as often, they really steer us astray. So I'm sure you're all aware of the very egregiously wrong initial estimates of Ebola, which had to do with certain types of modeling assumptions about how Ebola would spread. The people who made some of the most prominent of those models still say that they were glad that the numbers came out the way they did because they generated action. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we have now even a further, more complicated view about how diseases can spread. And it's a view that really does eliminate this notion that the disease is the enemy, because the focus is no longer on it, it's on us. It's on how we interact with one another. Where I think we're going, and I'll explain this a little bit more at the end, is towards a much more chaotic view of the natural world in which we as humans live. One that is, I think, increasingly difficult to capture in even complex network-type models. And that's because there are a couple of unknowns that really sort of break the bank. And one of the big ones, of course, is climate change. And what we see in the world is, in some ways, a steady stream of large-scale events. This is obviously a very incomplete list, but it gives you some of the highlights. So top line, these are the major flu pandemics of the last 100 years. Next come major storms. Of course, if you looked at mortality, these aren't the storms that count. Those would be all of the storms that essentially hit Bangladesh, which is one of the future points of incredible calamity for climate change and global sea rise. Next come earthquakes, then floods, then what we'll talk about in a minute, infectious diseases that are new or unusual. And then in the italics, all the things that we do to ourselves, either intentionally or unintentionally, having to do with terrorism and explosives and firearms. Next, chemicals. Next, anthrax and things like that. And next, nuclear disasters. And I'm sure you know, based on the bottom line now, that the nuclear industry has about the same failure rate, about 1%, that other non-highly reliable industries have. So we're entering a new era, I think, of concern about that. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. Really what we have is a stage now, and really for the last 50 years, where we are the global disruptors. So this is a very beautiful picture that was created by a group led by a former student of mine, Cameron Kahn, who's in Toronto, who was asked by the Canadian government and then funded by the CDC after SARS to get a better grip on things like the SARS outbreak in Toronto, which caused billions of dollars in global damage to the city and also led to many people becoming sick and many losing their lives. So what they've done is they've purchased airline data and combined it with models that look at things like water supply, sanitation, demographics. And they are getting better at predicting where diseases can go. So they were asked, for example, by the CDC to predict where the cholera outbreak in Haiti might go. And they were not perfectly predictive, but their estimates were good. There were some countries where they said it won't go because there's access to clean water and adequate sanitation, and they were right about that. This represents 2.1 billion flights a year now, about 800 million of those in the United States. So this is a big mixing pot, and that mixing pot goes to many places that look like this. And any insurer will tell you that a risk is the likelihood that a threat will exploit a vulnerability, and this is our vulnerability. And it's really one of our major global vulnerabilities now. This is, I think, a very depressing slide about plastic production. And plastic is obviously incredibly important with regard to Zika because of the thousands of mosquito species that exist in the world. Zika happens to be one that likes plastic. To even further depress you, and I'm sorry about doing this, is this theoretical. It's not proven. It's not scientific fact, but it's a reasonable projection. And it just gives you a sense of the scope of the plastic problem that we have put ourselves in over the last 50 years. So the mosquito species, the Aedes aegypti and albopictus species that transmit Zika, happen to transmit Zika, evolved from a tree hole dwelling mosquito in Central Africa, most likely. And because of that, they have the ability to live in pretty clean water compared to, for example, the Culex mosquito that transmits West Nile virus, which has to live in pretty foul water to live. So all of these, tires, buckets, et cetera, these are perfect environments in which these two exploiters can live. I was just up in Hamilton at Colgate, and I killed one of these against the wall. It was obvious because of the striations on the leg. When I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago to folks, including some veterinarians at Cornell, one mentioned that they were trapping this species in Montana in the mid-2000s. So when we look back even 10 years ago at estimates of where these mosquitoes lived, the thought was that they would only exist between these two lines, which are the January 10 degrees centigrade isotherms. Of course, when we reevaluate that with newer information, and you can just take a look at the United States, even though Florida and Georgia and many other states are underneath that isotherm, because of the intense efforts to get rid of these mosquitoes, really starting about 50 years ago and continuing for several decades thereafter, those were not included. But a more recent, again, model-based, because we don't know where these mosquitoes are, effort to find out where these are, shows a much wider distribution in the United States and around the world. These mosquitoes are responsible for dengue, which a recent paper estimated affects anywhere between 50 and 80 million people a year. And also the newer ones, chikungunya, West Nile virus, and now Zika. These are arboviruses. Talk about invasion. So everyone in the press has been talking about how this emerged. There's a kind of a trope of diseases emerging from Africa or from the forest. Ebola is one of these. But in fact, the first case here was not so simple. It was actually diagnosed in a primate who was brought into that densely forested area of Uganda for experimental purposes, and then was infected by the mosquito. And then it went away after 1947, only to show up a decade later in Nigeria, and then it began its strange progression across the Pacific, starting in the mid-2000s, leading to the situation now where it is all over Central and South America, and the latest estimates from late last month are that it's in 33 countries. I don't want to go into too much detail, especially because of time, but as you know, there are three problems with this disease. One is that it causes microcephaly in a certain proportion of pregnant women who become infected during their pregnancy. The second is that it causes this ascending paralysis called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which, according to the standard articles that exist, and this might change with the cases related to this particular virus, lead to death in 5% of cases and permanent disability in 20% of cases. So both of those are very important future health burdens for the populations that are affected. The estimate in the United States for the lifetime cost of caring for someone with mental retardation is about $1 million per person. And for Guillain-Barré is about $300,000 because so many of them require extended stays in intensive care units. So in an era of constrained healthcare budgets, these are going to just break the bank. The third thing that I should mention is that there are increasing signs that there are additional long-term neurological sequelae for this particular disease that, for the most part, remain unknown. So if you were to design an adversary in a wartime situation, I don't think you could really do much better than this. This is a disease that, according to Michael Spector in The New Yorker in a really nice article back in 2012, described being carried on a vector that looks like an Air Force fighter wing floating over, inches over the surface of the ground, biting multiple times, feeding during the day silently, and then causing all of these terrible health effects. And so what do we do about that? Well, these are actually pictures taken by my aunt, who happened to be in Cuba when Obama was there. But she was walking one morning through a nice square, and an army truck came through and did this, which is fumigation. So we wage war on the thing that wages war against us. And there's been, at least initially, a backlash against this from some physicians in Brazil who think that this is really the wrong approach and feel that instead of addressing this problem with a chemical inundation, which itself has unknown health consequences, that general primary care interventions may be a better way to go, at least an adjunct to the overt warfare. And I think where we wind up in a situation like this, which is still evolving obviously, is that we have a number of reactions to this other that come out of partly our legacy of warfare against germs, so we try to eliminate it. We also have our intelligence agencies, so to speak, so the NIH and the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, which are trying to rapidly take dengue vaccines and turn them into Zika vaccines so we can outwit it. But we rarely seek to coexist, and we even less frequently seek to address some of the fundamental issues in the environment in which we live that allow for this to occur. So I think the two that I've mentioned, one is climate change, increasing the range of these mosquitoes, and the other is waste. And these, of course, are not health issues per se, but these are issues that will, of course, change the way that we can react. And I think that, getting back to the issue of medical school education, we now face an imbalance in our human natural world ecosystem that I predict will only increase as we see month by month climate change records dropping, and we see even more devious, to use the military term, enemies come at us. I mean, I can imagine viruses that do much more than this, even though this is pretty horrible in and of itself. So one thing to think about in terms of a theory of public health that really is absent, and I would look to members of this audience and other New School faculty and other intellectuals to think about chiming in on this, is that we don't have, for example, an intergenerational ethic of public health. A great example of this is about 3 months ago, 2 articles came out simultaneously. One was an article about overfishing, showing that the WHO and UN estimates of the number of fish culled from the sea had actually been overestimates of the number that were there, and that we've, for the last 10 years, really been on a steady decline in the productivity in terms of fish in the sea. Whether the plastic issue that I mentioned has something to do with this is unclear. It probably does. But overfishing itself is probably the main culprit. At the same time, a very interesting study came out of Spain, a study that took pregnant women and randomized them to eating a lot of fish, or eating a little bit of fish, or eating no fish. And the unconditioned result of that study was eating the most fish is the best for your baby. So you take these two findings and you put them together, and you have to ask whether there should have been in that straightforward medical public health publication any addressing of the fact that maybe this is not a sustainable thing to say. And then you wind up with the very difficult balancing of, I want the best for my children, I want to keep my children safe, I want my community to be healthy, and yet we live in an environment that increasingly is going to pose risks to my children, to my neighbors, to myself. And I think where we are now is back where we were perhaps 150 years ago, where the death of a child was seen as the normal course of affairs. That notion is obviously in New York, in a developed, rich, Western environment, inconceivable to think that I would have a child and then not see the death of that child, for example, as anything but a terrible tragedy, and certainly not see it as the normal course of affairs. But what I believe we are doing now with the way in which we as a global society are running the earth is setting ourselves up for a future in which our future generations have less of a chance to enjoy the good health that we have. And that raises the question of whether we are actually the invasive other into the future of our own society. So I'm going to leave it with that. Thank you very much.